Welcome to the next in our ongoing series, Journeying with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. A quick bit of math as we're getting started. I know usually we don't include math as part of our Bible studies. Mark's Gospel is, by our numbering, 16 chapters. Those aren't of equal length, and chapter 16 is just 8 verses long in the original. We'll get there. But that means that roughly we are at 2/3 of the way through. And we've just got the remaining chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and the very short chapter 16. And yet, the last third of Mark's gospel covers just 1 week of Jesus' life. And one of those days he's buried and in a grave for. We're about to enter the last basically 5 days of Jesus' earthly life and ministry before the cross. And then the hints of promise of life beyond in resurrection. But that means that the time scale is about to slow down, or Jesus' days are about to get much busier and much fuller. So as we continue on from here with the story that begins chapter 11, that we often call in the life of the church Palm Sunday, I want you to remember, this is now entering the last 5-6 days of Jesus' life. Things are slowing down as far as how fast time is passing, and a lot more is happening. And this is all packed into a very short amount of time as Jesus heads into the city of Jerusalem when the Passover is about to be celebrated. So it's a big national time of celebration. The whole people are getting ready, but things are tense because they are always tense in those holiday times, and the Romans sort of crack down on things. All that's in the background as our story unfolds now with chapter 11. And the first story we're going to take a look at begins in about the first 11 verses of chapter 11. It goes like this. When they were approaching Jerusalem, at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there tied a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here immediately.' They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street, and as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, 'What are you doing untying the colt?' They told them what Jesus said, and they allowed them to take it. They brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches they had cut in the field. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest.' Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, it was already late. He went out to Bethany with the 12. Okay, so folks who have been a part of church life for any time at all probably know the version of the story we call Palm Sunday. The short version, Jesus heads into the city triumphantly. People are waving palm branches, spreading them down on his pathway in the street. Some are taking their clothes, their cloaks, their robes, and strewing them in the path as Jesus enters, and people are crying out in songs of praise, Hosanna, like cheering at a ball game or at a sporting event or at a parade, cheering, Hosanna in the highest, blessed is the one coming in the name of the Lord. It's this exciting, triumphant moment. And Mark, the gospel writer, probably assumes that we, the readers, know enough of the background that he doesn't fill in details because it would have been obvious to him. But we maybe need to stop and unpack things for a moment. Okay, let's start at the beginning of the scene. Jesus is headed toward the city of Jerusalem from the outskirts, from the small villages around, what we would call the suburbs, right? In the greater metropolitan area of Jerusalem. Jesus has been headed toward Jerusalem for some time. In fact, in the beginning of the last chapter, we sort of had this directional marker. Jesus was beginning the journey, and the disciples are still not clear about what the trip to Jerusalem is actually going to mean. So Jesus has deliberately, intentionally, knowingly headed in this direction. Now, we don't have the cues for it yet. Mark hasn't said to us that we're getting close to the Passover time, but pretty soon it'll be evident when, in just a few chapters, Jesus will be celebrating the Passover dinner with his disciples. And it's worth knowing also that, like any empire, honestly, when the empire senses there's going to be trouble among the locals, they crack down, right? You have an increased military presence. If you're worried that there's going to be riots or upheavals or demonstrations or things are going to get out of hand, you put an increased, in this case, military/police presence. That's what the Roman armies are doing as they occupy this area. There's no separate civil police force exactly. The Romans sort of just clamp down and would want to take the energy out of any possible uprisings they get hints about or have suspicions about. And because this time of year at Passover is a time when the people of Israel, the Judean people there in Jerusalem, remember and celebrate basically their independence, right? Being freed from slavery to Pharaoh, and it's sort of this distinctive marker, this distinctive festival that marks their story, their identity as the people of God. This is, in a lot of ways, like Independence Day and Christmas and Thanksgiving all rolled into one. It's a national holiday, it's a religious holiday, it's a cultural holiday, it's a joyful time, but also tells a pretty serious and important story. All that rolled into one, and there were times prior to Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem where would-be messiahs, people who imagined they were going to be the one to lead the revolution, would start riots or start events thinking, this is the day we're going to take their country back from the Romans. They were going to throw off the shackles of the oppressive Romans. That kind of language, and that sort of spread at a time like this. So the Romans, I want to give them both credit. They are trying to avoid chaos and anarchy by clamping down, but also they want to, at any point, brandish their power and remind the people in the city of Jerusalem and all around just who's boss. The Romans want to make an example out of anybody they think is a troublemaker. And part of that, then, every year, history records for us, before the Passover would be celebrated, the Romans would at some point, beef up security basically and march into town. You could imagine this sort of big impressive parade coming through with a local Roman governor, in this case, Pontius Pilate, marching in the centurions all in their gleaming armor and their polished weapons and carrying banners, with the Roman insignia announcing Rome will rule forever. A way of telling the people before anything gets started, we're the ones who are in charge here. Don't cross us. Don't stop us. And the idea was to be as intimidating as possible, right? So the way, like in banana republics or in communist dictatorships or things like that, you'll see like big military parades marching down the city streets. That's meant to make the government look tough and strong. Look how impressive we are, like they need to brag about their weapons, but also to send a message to anybody who might be a threat. You be careful, we've got all these things. We will use them on you if you force us to, or if we feel like it, if we feel we need to make an example of you, right? So it's that same kind of insecurity that drives the dictator's military parade that the Romans would have done as well, going into Jerusalem. And against that backdrop, knowing that that's happening, maybe even within a matter of hours or days of when Jesus' entry is, that casts Jesus' entry as in a whole new light. That number one, that Jesus is well aware that everybody had seen all their lives long the marching of the Roman soldiers in every year at Passover as sort of this show of Roman force. And number two, that Jesus does what he does knowingly, and knowing that in some ways what he does won't compete with Rome and all of its majesty and might and force, so that Jesus sort of launches an upside-down parade. Instead of marching in on the war horse, the big white horse and the armor and all that, sort of brandishing weapons and all in matching order and in rhythm and step like that, Jesus borrows a colt of a donkey. So this is a young donkey that, as Jesus notes, has never been sat on. That means that this horse ain't been broke. That means nobody has trained this horse how to have a human on it. Can you imagine how foolish, how potentially foolish you would look taking the risk of riding an animal that has never been ridden before and trying to get it to go through city streets? It's almost a deliberate mockery of what Rome does. I mean, Rome takes itself very seriously as it marches its soldiers through. Look how tough we are. Look how strong we are. And here's Jesus, the unarmed, homeless Jewish rabbi, going through the streets, riding on a donkey, and borrowing the ancient imagery from Israel's memory about how its kings were supposed to act. The image of a king riding in on a donkey, Jesus didn't invent. That's borrowed from the imagery in the book of the prophet Zechariah, who imagines the king coming, God's rightfully chosen king coming in on a donkey. Riding in not on the mighty war horse or a chariot or anything like that, but riding in on this lowly, humble, stubborn, ornery animal. So at its best moments, Israel was meant to understand it was supposed to have a different picture of kingship. Instead of a human being who wielded the power of God with might and power and wealth and strength and brute force and the ability to terrorize your enemies and crush them, Israel's kings were meant to be understood as servant leaders. They were never supposed to point to themselves and their own greatness. In fact, at the points when they did, God regularly sent prophets to smack them down and take them down a few pegs and say, you were supposed to be a servant leader. Your role at best is to point to God's good governing. You are to execute God's ways of justice and mercy for all, and to lead people in good directions, not to point to yourself or puff up your own military might or just focus on, well, those aren't how you're supposed to do things. So Jesus, when he borrows a donkey, does it well aware this is loaded with royal imagery in Israel's memory, but that imagery itself is meant to be a servant. Kind of like in the old legends they would tell in England. There's the memory of the great King Arthur, who was the one who united, all the people of England to be united as Britain, the famous Round Table story, in the quest for the Holy Grail, all that business in Arthur's Camelot in England. And yet part of the legend of Arthur is the old legend of the sword in the stone, right? Is this sort of pipsqueak kid. Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone and reveals unknowingly that this poor pipsqueak kid is the true and rightful King of England. There's something in that cultural myth and that memory that English culture tells that says, at its best, their king wasn't supposed to be a tyrant or a jerk or a bully or just the strongest guy with the most weapons, but someone who was unexpected, lowly, who then turns out to be the rightful king. In that piece of British culture and storytelling, there's some of that upside downness that is definitely there as Jesus goes into the city of Jerusalem. It's at the same time a calling back to Israel's memory of their kings are supposed to be different, servant leaders who ride on these humble, lowly animals, not pointing to their own greatness. And the moment you would see a king pointing to how great they are or talking about how awesome and important they were, you knew they had gone off track. You knew they didn't have God's heart anymore. And at the same time, this whole scene is kind of a mockery of just how ridiculous Rome looks as it sort of blusters its way marching into town. The whole rest of this week, when Rome appears, it's going to be doing what Rome knows how to do, right? Bully people, intimidate them, and torture them as a way of making an example out of the people it thinks are troublemakers. And at every turn, Jesus offers an alternative. Now notice, there's lots of messianic stuff going on here, right? All the imagery of the coming king, that's what everybody expects the Messiah to be. So people there in the crowd, you got to imagine some of them might have been confused. Some of them might have thought, okay, Jesus, he really is a Messiah, and they might have assumed Messiah is exactly what we thought. This is the time we're going to raise up our army and we're going to overthrow those oppressive Romans. Now, Jesus is going to have to defuse that as the week goes on. We who've been on the journey with Jesus knew it took 8, 9 chapters for the disciples to get on the same wavelength that Jesus was the Messiah, and then he spent the last several chapters deconstructing that and saying, but Messiah isn't what you think. It's not the violent revolutionary. It's not the conquering king, but in fact the suffering servant. And that's not an accident or a failure. That's the intention. That's God's plan. One and only plan A, and there is no plan B. That is what Jesus is carrying into this moment. But of course, everybody else who has not been walking with Jesus, hearing him say things like, I'm going to a cross, it's easy for them to get stirred up and for this moment to sort of become a tipping point. So of course, the respectable religious people who don't want there to be utter chaos and who don't want to see a crackdown from the Romans are especially upset at this. And that's sort of where things go from here. For the next piece of chapter 11, we're going to take several little sections that form a sort of sandwich or bookend. The fancy word is an inclusio. We've seen them before. We'll talk about it in a minute. But listen how we start with the scene with the fig tree, we move to a scene in the temple, and then come back to the fig tree, like Mark is trying to highlight or call attention to something. So let's listen. This is going to follow along in verses 12 and go all the way through 25, but you're going to see it sort of in three sections. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to it to see whether perhaps he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, when they passed by, as they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots, then Peter remembered, and it said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses." Okay. Hopefully you caught that sort of three-part movement. We start with they're headed into the city. So basically, like, Jesus and his friends are hanging out. They're staying at a hotel or a friend's house out in the suburbs. And every day, as they're getting ready for the festival, they go into the city of Jerusalem, going through gates every time to enter the city wall. So on this particular day, on the way into town, Jesus sees the fig tree in the distance, sees by chance are there any figs on it. No, it's springtime. There's no figs on the tree. It's spring. The tree is just putting out leaves for the early part of the year. And Jesus curses the fig tree because there are no figs on it. We'll come back to that in a moment. But notice then the middle section is that scene in the temple. And then we come back to the fig tree. Now, we've seen times before when Mark, our movie maker, has done something like this before. Well, he'll take a scene and kind of split it in half and put something in the middle. And they sort of all mutually interpret each other. That the outside part becomes kind of a lens to make sense of what happens in the middle. That these are all interacting. We saw it before with Jairus' daughter. At the beginning of that scene, and then in the middle, there's the woman who'd been bleeding for the same 12 years that Jairus' daughter has been alive. And then we come back to Jairus' daughter at the end. We've seen a couple other times where there's that kind of a bookending kind of a move. If you're a biblical scholar, you call it an inclusio, but the less fancy is it's like a bookend or a sandwich if you're hungry. So in this particular scene, the middle section, the meat of our sandwich, the books on the bookshelf between the bookends, so to speak, is this scene in the temple where Jesus, who has already seen the day before what was going on, sees basically the commerce going on in the temple and overturns the money changers' tables, drives out the animals, and announces, "This was meant to be a house of prayer for all peoples, and you've made it a den of robbers." Okay, so a couple of things we have to deal with. In the temple, number one, this isn't an off-the-cuff, I can't control my anger kind of moment from Jesus where he's just taken totally aback by surprise. We saw in the previous section, after the entry into Jerusalem with the palm branches, Jesus goes into the temple and looks around. So whatever had been happening the day before was happening on this day too. Jesus had seen that whole setup. So maybe it's that anger has been simmering and he's been thinking, what am I going to do about it? But this isn't just like Jesus in an unthought out, outrageous, blindly doing things and being given permission to blindly do things. This is meant to be a conscious, intentional, symbolic act. Like the prophets back in the times of the Old Testament and the centuries before would do actions that were provocative and as symbolic acts saying something about the state of the people of God, about the condition of their spiritual lives. So, for example, the prophet Amos at one point goes to the worship center in the northern part of Israel, in Bethel, and announces God is not pleased with what they're doing. And the religious people there want to drive him out because they're upsetting the established order. And anytime you tell people that what you are doing is upsetting God, or that it doesn't fit, people get upset. We like the convenient pictures and systems and orders, the way I think things are. If somebody says, hey, maybe you're a little bit out of step, it's real easy to lash out and say, you're not just attacking my beliefs, you're attacking God, you're trying to cancel God, you're trying to cancel the temple. And that's not really what's happening. And yet, at another level, part of what Jesus does is symbolically to bring to an end, to halt or to destroy what's going on in the temple. There's not really evidence exactly that the people in the temple changing money or selling doves were particularly crooked or criminal. It's not necessarily that, but more like this has become a whole system where instead of being focused on God, right, house of prayer for all peoples, we've now made this whole religious industrial complex that in order to get access to God, now there's animals that have to be involved because I'm not bringing my animal from home to offer it as a sacrifice, so I buy one when I get to the temple, and now there's money involved, now there's business, now there's commerce involved. How easy it is to lose focus on what this place was supposed to be. And at its best, the temple itself was always meant to be sort of this symbolic meeting place between God and humanity, right? And in case you don't have your mental map of what the temple looked like, in the very, very center was this room they called the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, where the box of the Ark of the Covenant with the commandments had once been kept before it had been lost to the mist of time. Inside there was the place that it was symbolically believed God dwelt with the people. And outside that, there's a chamber, the holy place. And then beyond that, there are these sort of rings of concentric circles or gates or courtyards where different people were allowed to be. But the idea that there in the center, there where the temple curtain separated God's presence on the inside and the holiest place with all of us in our not holiness on the outside. That's the place where God was symbolically meant to dwell with the people. Now, at their best moments, at their most faithful moments, the people of Israel and Judah were meant to understand, of course, God doesn't live in the box. God is everywhere. God fills all creation. But man, once you build a building and say, this is our God building, it's awfully easy to act like this is the building where God is. If you want access to God, you have to jump through the hoops that we say, and we control them, and you have to meet the proper behavior requirements. You have to offer the proper sacrifice. You have to get rid of those yucky pagan coins because they have, engraven images of Caesar and emperors on them, and instead you have to get our coins. Now, all of a sudden, this place that was meant to symbolize God and humanity being able to meet now has gotten obscured by all sorts of other layers of business as usual. And Jesus basically brings all that crashing to an end. Jesus knows that he isn't going to stop them from picking up even later on that afternoon. But this is meant to be a sign basically of judgment, of like, this is it, this whole system isn't going to work anymore. And in fact, I think that's part of what's going on with the fig tree, right? At the beginning, Jesus sees the fig tree, looks for figs, there aren't any, and curses it. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. When we come back to the fig tree, after that scene in the temple, this tree is all shriveled up. It's almost like Jesus was giving this thing a chance. It didn't do anything, and now Jesus is giving up. Okay, that's no longer a helpful structure anymore. Jesus announcing basically, I'm giving up on not only the tree, but the tree sort of becomes a stand-in for the whole temple structure, that whole symbol, that whole way of trying to connect to God. Lots of theologians and scholars have suggested that what Jesus is doing by driving out the animals and basically shutting down business at the temple is a symbolic destruction of the temple, and that Jesus intends that he becomes the meeting point between God and humanity. Certainly that at least fits with how broader Christian theology talks about who Jesus is, right? All throughout the story of Mark's gospel, we've been seeing Jesus presented as not just interesting religious teacher, not just as a self-help guru, not even as a respectable religious person, but as the embodiment of God's own presence with us, saying and doing things that only God is allowed to say and do, or only God has the power to say and do. And so, it fits at least to say that Jesus, in his own life and death and resurrection, becomes that living, embodied meeting point between God and humanity. And that instead of requiring a place that you have to go to offer up an animal for sacrifice, Jesus seems to embody, nope, we're done with that. And in Jesus' own life, there is the meeting point of God and humanity and the end of sacrifice. Because, as the later New Testament writers will see, in Jesus, he becomes the final sacrifice himself. But we're done with all of that with Jesus' death on the cross. In fact, about a generation after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, an insurrection from the people, basically a revolutionary movement started, and the Romans cracked down, and in the year 70 AD, destroyed the temple, like once and for all, knocked it down and destroyed it, and it had never been rebuilt since. There's the crumbling corner of the foundation of that building still to this day in Jerusalem, but AD 70, so just 35 years maybe or so after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the actual temple was destroyed. And even Judaism, outside of Christianity, has had to figure out since then how to relate to God without a temple to go to. Now, of course, both Christians and the Jewish community alike know in the storytelling that we've been able to connect to God even without a temple, that there was long centuries before the temple was even built that humans related to God, and both Christianity and Judaism since then has had to sort of figure out, do we need a meeting place? Do we need a single place where we all go to? Christianity's answer to that question has basically been no. Jesus becomes that focal point. Judaism has had to come up with other ways of answering that question, centering instead of sacrifice on prayer and gathering in the synagogue, and the word, the reading and exposition of Scripture has become sort of the center point of rabbinic Judaism that came out of the destruction of the temple. But in a sense, what happens there in the cleansing of the temple moment is sort of foreshadowing this critical moment that in history would happen within just a generation of Jesus' own lifetime. So what I want to suggest is the fig tree scenes at the beginning and the end are meant to sort of like be a walking object lesson about what happens in the temple. That when Jesus goes, having seen what was going on in the temple and shutting it down for the day, this is like Jesus washing his hands, not just of some other outside village that rejected him, but of the temple in the heart of Jerusalem itself, saying, you all have missed the point, and now I'm giving up on this system. Nope. And yet Jesus also knows that by deliberately doing this kind of act of violence and vandalism in the temple, man, that's going to anger the powerful people who are the respectable religious people in Jerusalem. The chief priests and the scribes are now looking explicitly for a reason to kill, or not just a reason, they found a reason. They're looking for a way to kill him because their best intention is they don't want to see this spill over and become a riot that now the Romans come and start killing and crucifying everybody. But they also see in Jesus that if enough people become a part of this movement, and if he does allow it to become violent, maybe they haven't been listening to him, but if it does become violent, this could get really bad really fast. They also see in what Jesus is doing that Jesus is basically saying, there's a way to be connected with God that doesn't require all this structure, all this institution, all this temple stuff. And that upsets them. Their whole way of understanding God, not just their livelihood, not just a way of getting a paycheck, their whole way of understanding God is connected to this building, this structure. This is how our religion works. We get awfully uncomfortable at the idea that our religious institutions or practices might need change or reform, and sometimes we get so tense about that we assume, you're attacking God. No, it's possible to say the institution needs to be reformed, needs to be changed, and yet we still heartily, deeply believe in God. This is one of those moments where Jesus' action comes off like it looks like he's trying to cancel God or cancel the temple. And instead, Jesus is trying to call them back to what it was meant to be about already, and to see in himself is the true meeting point between God and humanity. In a sense, in that final exchange that Jesus has with Peter about believing in the power of what you've asked for with faith, that in some ways there's a similar thread going on. That Peter had approached Jesus when he sees the next day the fig tree has withered. We're now on the Tuesday of Holy Week, and Peter says, "Hey Jesus, that fig tree that you cursed, it's all withered. Isn't that amazing?" And Jesus' response is kind of like, well, faith makes these kinds of things possible, but Jesus again turns us, I think, away from treating faith like magical thinking. Like if I believe hard enough, I can get stuff because faith is magic. But it's about faith in God. Jesus is clear on this, right? Don't have faith in faith. Not just it's the power of my believing that makes it so. Like if I concentrate really hard enough and say, I'm going to start flying, I'll fly. But it's about faith that's aimed in God, rooted in God. That God is always the one who was powerful enough to uproot trees and throw them into the sea, or move mountains, or raise the dead, or whatever. But it's always about faith aimed in God, rooted in God, that helps avoid the idea of turning this into magical thinking. And then that interesting last sentence that we get at the very, very tail end of this section, where Jesus, while we're talking about prayer, says, and ask God to forgive and forgive other people if they have anything against you, so that God will forgive you as well. We don't get a version of what we call the Lord's Prayer in Mark's Gospel, but this snippet sure feels like it comes from that same body of Jesus' teaching. In whatever version of the Lord's Prayer that you're familiar with, whether it's patterned off of Matthew's telling or Luke's telling, or the sort of more liturgical form we use on Sunday mornings, our forgiving of other people and God's forgiveness of us are intertwined. We don't necessarily have to get into a conversation about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. In a sense, God's forgiveness of all of us logically and chronologically predates even our own lives. But there needs to be a tight connection between God has forgiven us and I'm called to forgive other people. These things go hand in hand. And if I try and separate them and say, I'm wallowing in God's forgiveness, I can do whatever I want, and refuse to be a person of forgiveness toward other people, something has gone wrong. Jesus is pulling us away from magical thinking all through this, whether we treat prayer or faith as a magical object or building like the temple as a magical object. It's never been about magic. It's always been about the meeting place between God and humanity, which now happens in Jesus himself. That leads us to the concluding section of chapter 11 now. In this final section of chapter 11, we're going to get a scene where there's a controversy again between Jesus and the respectable religious people still in Jerusalem. This is going to go from verse 27 through 33. Again, they came to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave this authority to you to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you with what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. "If we say from heaven," he will say, "why then did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin?" They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." You can feel the tension building with every scene, basically. No wonder, in just a matter of days, the politically powerful and the respectable religious people will form an alliance to get rid of Jesus. They approach Jesus, having just witnessed the showdown of what Jesus had done in the temple, turning over the money changers' tables, driving out the animals, and announcing basically that the whole system had become corrupt. That's scandalous, right? That's front page news. That's Jesus starts a riot in the temple. I mean, it would have been easy to say Jesus was committing acts of domestic terrorism. He's threatening our most important national symbols. I mean, imagine somebody, spray painting on the Washington Monument. People would be upset, right? Even if they had a point, even if whatever they were spraying had an important point or something like that, we get upset about these things that we treat as sacred or important to our national or cultural identity. So Jesus has certainly provoked people. The religious people ask a question, and I don't know that it's fair at this point to say they ask it earnestly. They're, again, looking for, whoa, where do you get the gall? Where do you get the notion that you have the authority to do this? But it comes back to an authority question. Who gave you the authority to do things like this, Jesus? You're knocking over the tables and shutting things down in the temple. Where did you get the authority to do this? Now, for us who've been following along with the story, we know Jesus' answer. We know Mark's answer. Jesus has the very authority of God, right? This is the one who speaks to the wind and the waves, and they obey him, raising a question of Jesus having divine authority. Jesus is the one who speaks out to the evil spirits and they come out of people. Jesus speaks to illness and heals people. Jesus, again and again, speaks as somebody with authority, and it just sort of flows out of him, that he doesn't have to keep bragging about it himself. He speaks and it happens, kind of like the way God speaks the universe into being in the beginning of the creation story. So we know the answer of where Jesus' authority comes from. Mark has not been shy about telling us or giving us pictures of that all along the way. But Jesus then turns the table back on these respectable religious people. In a sense, this is just good rabbinic practice, right? Any decent rabbi knows if you just give somebody a straightforward answer, the conversation is over. If I provoke another question from you, maybe we can actually get somewhere. Maybe we can actually dig a little bit deeper. Jesus' answer isn't really just evasive. Sometimes we treat it like when he says, well, I'll answer a question if you answer mine, and then he just throws them a puzzler that they'll never come up with an answer for. I don't think that's it. When Jesus asked them back, okay, well, I'll tell you what, John the Baptizer, where was his authority from? Was he just a human being who, appointed himself, or did he really come with God's authority too? And they say, I don't know. Jesus is basically tying his authority to the same source as John's, right? That if you're gonna write off John, okay, you can write off Jesus too. But if you're gonna recognize that Jesus was appointed from God, was sent with God's voice of authority too, Jesus and John on multiple points have been on the same wavelength, announcing the reign of God has come near. You can be a part of it. Turn and be a part of it now. Let go of the old way of life and be drawn into the new kingdom way of life. Be a part of the reign of God here and now. Jesus is basically just saying, did you believe that? Was John right when he said it? Because if he was right, the kingdom is right here. It's in me. You got rid of John, or at least the political powerful people, the folks connected with Herod, they got rid of John, but the movement, the kingdom of God, the reign of God is still right here in me. You can still be a part of it, but you got to admit, at this point, you have to take sides, you respectable religious people. That, I think, is the tricky part, right? The respectable religious people have tried to walk a fine line. When John came on the scene and announced things like repent because God's action is coming, they were okay in concept with the idea of turning your life around and giving it to God. As long as you didn't get too much into detail, okay, yeah, John, that's a fine message. Okay, they could support it. But when then John runs afoul of the politically powerful, when King Herod decides he doesn't like this would-be prophet poking his nose in his private affairs, and then puts John in prison, it became convenient for everybody to just clam up about John, and maybe to treat him like, oh, that poor martyr, he got killed by the powerful people, by a corrupt king, but not really to want to take up his cause. Jesus has actually taken up not only John's cause, starting his ministry when John had been arrested, but taking up his message, the kingdom of God, the reign of God has come near. Jesus is basically saying back to the respectable religious people, do you believe John's message, that the reign of God has come near? Because if that's true, if God's really what God has authorized, if that's the message God is sending, God's reign is happening, you can be a part of it in a new definitive way, then you're going to have to declare your allegiance to me and the movement I've begun, or you're going to stand in my way. If you're going to say, no, we need to have our building, our temple, our religious institutions, those things can't change, at some point you're going to have to pick sides. And that's basically where things are at. It's always tempting to feel like you want to keep quiet, like you don't want to have to take a side, and sometimes you aren't required to take a side, you aren't required to take a stand. There are times when we can say there's nuance and there's gray, and well, you have a point, but you have a point. It's important in life to know when are the moments when I can be clear and nuanced and see shades of gray. But then there are other times where you're forced to give a clear answer, yes or no. John the Baptizer, was he on the right wavelength? Did he have God's authority, or was he just sort of like some self-deluded schmo who decided he'd come from God? And the religious people know. If they say he came from God, Jesus will go like, well, how come you didn't believe him? And now here I am standing in line in continuity with John. Come and be a part of my movement. He and I are cut from the same cloth. We're part of the same movement of what God is doing. Or if they just say he was just some self-deluded schmo, well, everybody was convinced God really had sent him. And the respectable religious people are afraid of being unpopular. It's a difficult thing when we decide it is more important to be popular than to be faithful. Sometimes in life, the choice is clear and we just don't want to be faithful if it means somebody might not like it or we might not be popular anymore. Taking a stand like that, speaking up or being faithful to what you're convinced matters to God, that's tricky. This is one of those moments there where Jesus has been constantly trying to leave an open door for the respectable religious people to listen to what he has to say. We've noted a number of times that even when they seek him out, trying to trap him, trying to find something that they can use against him or weaponize against him, Jesus has not been vindictive and bitter and vengeful. He's tried to rise above and to be open. If you are seriously asking me a question, I will answer. I will talk with you. If you're just trying to do a gotcha question, I'm not going to play that game. But Jesus has been above board and has been able to look these people in the eye all along. And it's comfortable if you're the respectable religious person, the powerful person, not to want to lose that comfortable perch. That's where they're at. But in a way, the question now gets put to you and to me. What do we say about this Jesus and about John who came before him? Do we dare to believe that they really are correct, that God's reign really is breaking in now among us? And if we believe that, are we willing to reorient all the rest of our lives around Jesus and his way of life, his community, his new way of being that he calls the reign of God, his way where the least are raised above the greatest, and where the leaders are the ones who serve, where the first are last and the last are first. If we're willing to let our whole lives be reoriented around that kind of greatness that always looks upside down and laughable to the empires of the world coming marching into town with their armies and gleaming weapons, then we need to be prepared to have the rest of our lives overturned. That may mean, too, we even need to look at our own religious life. And it's tempting to read a story like this, to read this chapter and say, yeah, those people a long time ago, they had it all wrong. We've got it all right. It is really, really tempting to read the Bible that way. Oh, those people in the past, they had it all wrong. We're so much smarter and better than them. When instead, maybe this story calls us to ask, where are there places where if Jesus showed up and started overturning tables and shaking things around, would we take his criticism? Would we take his correction? Or would we drive him out because we don't want him to upset the systems and structures and familiar patterns we are used to? Part of following Jesus means allowing the possibility we're going to get it wrong sometimes. And when that happens, to decide we'd rather let Jesus reshape us and redirect us rather than dig our heels in and say, no, we can't be wrong. We don't realize we're doing it when we're doing it. The respectable religious people in this scene don't realize that they're basically drawing a line between them and Jesus and deciding they're going to dig their heels in rather than accept Jesus' insight. It doesn't have to be that way. But the day-by-day question for all of us is, when it comes down to it, will we let Jesus get our allegiance, even if that means change in other places, rearranging other things, and letting Jesus shake up the things we thought were solid? That's an intense moment to end on, but we need to be there because that's where the story takes us. Next time we want to invite you to join along with us, and we're going to take a look together next time at chapter 12 and 13. The tempo is going to build because in part we're getting closer and closer to Holy Week and Easter, and we're going to follow that urgency by continuing along. Next time we're going to take a look at chapters 12 and 13 together. Join us here as we journey with Jesus.